Welcome back to another episode of Taking Inventory. This week, really excited to welcome a longtime friend, great all-around guy, Per Sandell. Per, you're a legend in this space. Excited to have you join the podcast today.
Thanks, Daniel. Thrilled to be here. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you guys.
Thanks for coming on, buddy. So before we get started, we just want to go through your long ad tech sort of journey. It's been through a bunch of amazing companies, but it started, if I remember correctly, kind of from the toolbar space. So can you kind of walk us through like how you ended up there to now at Spotify?
Yeah, great question. I think for those of us who've been around in ad tech for a long time, we've definitely looked at a lot of opportunities to generate yield and revenue for businesses. And I guess we all had to start somewhere. And so, for me, first company I was working on was, web toolbars, but a nice way of saying it is loyalty media software. Not only did we have kind of like a search and toolbar business, but we also had like an affiliate and mall business. And that company was called Free Cause. Working on it with a couple of friends in the mid 2000s, and eventually sold that company to Rakuten in 2009. And I think we were one of the first US acquisitions of Rakuten. And, I think at that time, not a lot of people knew what Rakuten was. And, now it's on NBA jerseys. I think it's slowly becoming a household name in the US. And a lot of the technology we were working on then gradually morphed through other acquisitions and other kind of business areas the team had done on the Rakuten side. First into kind of, their online shopping mall product, as well as some of the search feeds that they were doing, and eventually kind of is now morphed into Rakuten loyalty. And I think, when you think about loyalty media, that's an area where, data about the activity and the behavior in those areas is really turned and harvested into monetization potential. And so, from that area, when you're starting to think about user data, you're starting to think about transactions, you're starting to think about, traffic generation, to then machine learning outcomes or ranking recommendations or product recommendations, email, et cetera. It's a very nice kind of jump start into ad tech as a whole. And, in many ways, I think we were kind of thinking a lot about how can we optimize the delivery that happens here? How can we optimize the search results page? How can we give people the right rewards to take the right action? If you think about what we do now with ad tech, it's not really that different than today. We're trying to both preserve user behavior and incentivize the correct user behavior that we're looking for. So definitely an early start kind of in ad tech. I think as an industry, we can probably look back to like 98, 99 for really when ad tech started. This was a little bit after that, but definitely the early days of the industry as a whole.
It's interesting to hear kind of that journey because it's almost like what's old is new again. It feels like kind of these Safari extensions, Chrome extensions are just toolbars, or kind of, as you put it, loyalty rewards, just wrapped in a new format, new technology, but really serve a very similar function. Am I understanding that right? Reading that right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In a way, the users are making like a very cognitive decision about like sharing their information and data for rewards. And, that behavior, I think we can go back like pre-internet to see that behavior continuing and being something that is a viable business model for the long term. And, now if you're looking, I think it's, another Snap alum, Krish, he's got his new app out there, Tin. And you're seeing a lot of this even from, things like Honey and their, pretty big acquisition by PayPal. And, you're definitely seeing that that's still a space that's very valuable. And, honestly, and you guys have talked about this in the pod before, but anytime you're able to capture transaction data within the environment, that's probably a very valuable signal to anything that you're going to do in ads and monetization. So, at the end of the day, it's really about what is the power of transaction data? And I think that's something arguably one of the most valuable data signals that we have in all of advertising today.
Totally. I mean, we talk about this a lot, this whole like thesis of like payments are the new cookies. And I totally agree. I think it definitely feels like the future. I guess in terms of maybe just like some of the tools that you're building now at Spotify, and then also the tools that you built in the past, can you give a little kind of insight about like how they've been inspired by like the things that we all saw early on in the Facebook world? And for people's kind of historical context. So we've all known Per. We've all been friends for like, I don't even know how long.
Probably 15 years now.
Yeah. And Per was the head of product at Nanigans when Daniel and I were building Shift. And so we all have been sort of in this walled garden world, kind of as long as it's existed. But you know, is there anything that you took away from those early days that you kind of see now as you're building stuff up at Spotify?
Yeah, a lot actually. What you said earlier about it, what old is new again, is very true in this space. And so, I think if we look back and, this is probably like 2010 ish when you were just getting Shift started, we were just getting Nana started. Um, I think we had very different approaches to kind of that ecosystem, and both of which I think were right approaches into the API ecosystem and how you can build, a development partner on top of APIs. And we'd invested, at that time very heavily into kind of building our own pixel, building our own measurement SDK. And we actually had become a Facebook MMP at that time. So we could capture the mobile signals in those areas. And, I think what we learned very quickly is that while you can target a segment of users that's, a broad audience, 1 million or a couple 100,000, any additional value you can do about understanding the performance of that segment provides better and more performant advertising. And so, we were trying to do a bunch of machine learning on top of Facebook's like kind of raw right-hand rail CPM bids. If you remember those in CPC when it was coming out, to better estimate the average revenue per user and the LTV of these users. And so, I think we were probably doing some of the first algorithmic bid adjustment into a walled garden environment at that time. And when we think about this kind of long term, what this can really mean is that there's a pretty significant amount of upside that you can get from ML that comes into advertising. And so from us, what we saw kind of in the Nanigans days, 15 years ago, was really that machine learning allowed us to basically capture actions that were happening down funnel from that initial ad click, and then value those back to understand really kind of like an optimized CPM component that was in the business at the time. And so I think as we look at that and we've transitioned, myself and our previous jobs at Snap, we were thinking about how can we handle this LTV within the walled garden? And that really comes with more access to signal, user data, purchase behavior, measurement transactions. And I think, outside of that, when we look back to kind of our time as API partners, we really undervalued a lot of the engagement data that platforms themselves had about the optimization of machine learning that they can do within the walls that are there. And so knowing things about like time spent as a user, what their negative response rate is to ads, and then also what their kind of, holistic journey looks like from session to session to session during the day, provides a significant uptick in value in just the raw transaction data. And so I think, from the Nanigans perspective, when we were looking at that in the old days, we really only valued the transaction data, not the ad interaction and on-platform data. And so now I think when I'm looking at the ad industry as a whole, I'm trying to value both what happens after the click and what happens before the click. And I think that's a really unique area that a lot of the larger online platforms can do today, because they have all of this engagement data about what happens on the platform. Do you engage with content that's red? Do you engage with content that's yellow or blue or purple? And as a result of that, you just know so much more about how to optimize an ad than you just do from the transaction data. And that can have a really big impact. And so I think we learned a lot in those early days about how measurement can work and influence that ecosystem. But from outside of one of the bigger publishers, you can never really know what the user engagement and like what their reaction really means to how valuable a certain placement or an impression is for them. And merging those two sets of data, I think, is pretty important.
And now fast forwarding, from your experience at Nanigans, and then obviously what we all worked on at Snap, joining Spotify, this is a company that is ad supported, but also has a pretty massive subscriber business, premium subscription business. But I think people would be surprised to hear kind of how many people and users are part of that ad supported tier. And you're building the technology to support that side of the business. And so what are you building, and what do you think the market and like people that hear about Spotify, the ad supported side of it, maybe don't understand?
Yeah. Yeah, Daniel, I think you're absolutely right on the scale of our user base. And so, I think when we talk about Spotify as a whole, we reported Q4 early February, about a month ago. And I think the number for that was about like 600 million, just north of 600 million total monthly active users on the service. And of those, about 375-ish, I think is about the right number, are actually in our ad supported tier. So, that's one massive growth that we've seen on our ad supported tier. I think we're up something like almost 30%, 28%, I think, year over year in the ad supported tier from user growth. And that's pretty exciting. And so, we're growing kind of our ads tier pretty quickly. And if you look at how many ad supported users we have, like that's a huge number. Like not only are we probably one of the largest subscription businesses on the planet at this point with that tier, but we're also now one of the largest ad supported content businesses on the internet as well. And so, we do really have two fundamental business models that are there. But, in order for us to build a very healthy business, we need to kind of support both. And so when it comes to the ads tier as a whole, we've obviously got, our ads and music content that are audio or audio ads and podcasts. And we've been starting to develop a number of units that are actually tied to video across the board. So if you're using Spotify in the free tier now, you're going to see a lot more video integrated into that offering to go alongside of the audio. And so we started to have, ads in our video podcasts that are there that are from a video perspective, as well as video ads that could come between content if you're foreground. We've got, muted video products that now exist on display if you've brought your app into foreground. And we think that's a really good engaging opportunity for us to build more kind of supply within those areas to really fuel our revenue growth and be able to pay creators out more of that. And I think, if you look to what our business has been doing, we've been paying out record numbers to both the indies as well as the labels and podcast creators across the board. And so, our business of building an ad supported business as well as the premium user business is really to support creators creating art long term. And I think for us, that also allows us to have a slightly different approach to how we think about advertising, because we really want to grow that number in order to bring more content on the platform and be able to support more creators. And so, from our perspective, we're really excited about like kind of what we're seeing in the growth of the free tier, because, ultimately a lot of the revenue that we generate from ads flows out to those creators on the other side. And so as we get to be a better ads business, it hopefully means that we're supporting both the music ecosystem as well as the talk ecosystem significantly better. And so on that note, we've also started to look a little bit about like what our on-platform behaviors are. And we've got a product that I think I'm allowed to talk about now, but it's going to be kind of like launched publicly within the next couple of weeks.
We can do like a hysterical bleep if this is not okay. So just say it and we'll fix it.
I think it's okay, but it's one that I've been kind of working on very closely with the team. But if you look at a lot of the other products that are out there, like, people are kind of like arbitraging YouTube views or like subs on Twitch or some of these other areas, but there hasn't really been a great option from a major platform for podcast creators to be able to buy optimized ads to drive traffic to them. And so we're coming out in our self-service ads tool with a podcast streams machine learning objective, very similar to what you've seen from kind of some of these others ones about reach it or clicks or purchase. But we're launching one directly around podcast streams. So advertisers can come in or podcast creators can come in, click a few boxes, very quickly make an ad, and then immediately optimize that to get more reach on their podcast to drive more traffic for their listeners, and in whole generate more ad revenue for them with more views or direct sales and the models that they've done. And so I think, when you think about our ad business, we're trying to build products, one, that advertisers love so we can really generate that top line. But, we also have an opportunity to work directly with our creators about growing the amount of consumption that happens on our platform with simple ad products. And now we've had for a long time a product that we call Spotify for Artists, where they can come in and kind of promote their music and get more streams on that. But we've never had that for podcasts, and we're launching that in the next couple of weeks. And I think that's going to be a pretty exciting opportunity for us, because it allows us to really become very incentive compatible with the advertisers that we're bringing on the platform, because they're content creators. And I think, when we think about Spotify ad tech, we really have to service that base in order to grow the consumption for these creators on the platform. But we are also starting to build a fairly significant amount of robust machine learning models that you've seen from other platforms that are out there, kind of the major like walled gardens. But I wouldn't really think about Spotify in the same way of like, a Facebook style walled garden. I think I've probably used this term before, but we're a little bit more of like a fenced in village because we offer an ads API. We've got an ad studio, but we also have a direct sales team that's working on IO. And that can come in and transact on top of our own tech, or we've got partnerships where you could do PG or PMP based buys into our ecosystem. And so we've really taken the approach with trying to capture the demand from advertisers in the way that they find it's the most friendly to sell, but are offering kind of our most robust models in areas where it is the easiest to kind of buy ads. And so, if you're thinking about the difference between ads that are bought versus sold, we're trying to make sure that we've got both those models in place to best support our customers from a scaling perspective.
And it's funny you mentioned just like the fence and village. I don't know if you know Connor McKenna over at Luma, but he talks about like the hedged garden. It's like,
Yeah, I
but
think we're a hedge garden. Yeah.
yeah, I think, but I guess like as you guys are going through sort of the ad monetization strategy, like I hadn't thought about how like in a weird way the rev share with your creators is like you could argue it's a form of CAC for you guys like to grow over time. Is that like part of the equation where you guys are like, listen, like X number of ad supported tiers will eventually move into premium, and so we can look at the margin profile a little differently? Like, is that like the game you have to play?
Um, I think in any business, you're always kind of looking at that P&L and trying to figure out like, particularly in streaming. And I think, you're seeing a lot of trouble in that space with some of the video streaming platforms of just like really having a hard time of calculating like what's the value of a piece of content versus the expected consumption, and then it results in ad return in those areas. And I think, it does become a very complex game of like P&L management. And I think that's actually pretty important in today's climate that we're in. And making sure that we're showing our ability to continue to generate free cash flow. And that's important to us as a business. But, for us as Spotify, I think we are really dedicated to making sure that we're trying to grow the amount of our payouts. And for us, that's extremely important. And probably the number one driving factor is to create more people who can live off their art. And so, while, you could approach this with like a very ruthless business approach, like, oh, well, we need to do X or we need to do Y. I think for us, we need to do X and Y, but we also need to make sure that, we're able to support the ecosystem of creators. Because like without a long-term health ecosystem in music and podcasting, business like ours can't exist. And so like the number one area that we need to make sure we're supporting with ads is that content creation. Because without it, it's going to be a pretty boring internet. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of places on the internet where, content quality is just not there as people are trying to cut corners on payouts and other things. Or you're just not producing things that are of a quality that you think you could like. And, a lot of credit to our teams who've been working really hard to get good content on our platform. And, I think we've done that both with a great consumer product as well as, great relationships with our content partners.
And one of the questions about like the ad products themselves is like, have you seen, given that you guys have, a bunch of video products, as you mentioned, and audio, like, have you learned something you didn't know before Spotify where like I think we probably would assume that like video is just more effective just based on like our previous roles, or that like people tuned out things when they were listening to podcasts? Like what's different about the psychology of these types of ad products than what you thought coming in?
Yeah. So I think there's two things like coming into Spotify, and for context, I've been here about, I think 18 months now. So definitely hopefully fully have my feet underneath me now. But I kind of had the assumption that a lot more of the consumption on our experience was backgrounded that actually is backgrounded. And so I think, we've been incredibly excited about the engagement that we've seen in the foreground. And you're also starting to see our consumer product to start to do more experiences that are foreground relevant, dating back to a couple years ago when they brought lyrics into the platform. You're now seeing kind of in those areas like, looping areas of videos or more engaging experiences that exist on the page, or, just more information and transparency that we're pushing out about the creator. And so I've been surprised about how much foreground consumption we have and generally about how much consumption we have on the platform. The user metrics that we see are incredibly healthy. And, I think that's something that we should continue to be laser focused on. Like how much time are people spending on it? Like, one statement that I've been thinking a lot about is like the time that we have from a user is like basically like if you multiply that by the number of users you have, that's like effectively your GDP, for lack of a better term. And, there's only so much time spent that you can get from all the users on the internet in a given day. And like, what is your fair share is something that we need to think a lot about. And like, by being both background and foreground, we're actually able to get a higher level of entitlement of that share from a particular user than an experience that is either exclusively in the background or exclusively in the foreground. And so from an ads business perspective, like our time spent is pretty exciting for us. But James, to answer your question directly, like other things that have surprised me is like, I think there's still a lot of complexity in the podcast advertising ecosystem. And that's one that, I think we need to make sure that we're trying to simplify podcast ads as a business and an ecosystem, because right now it's so complex and there's a lot of different offerings that it may confuse a lot of potential buyers, which will be limiting the overall potential entitlement that exists against podcasting as an industry. And I think, we've seen this in ad tech, like the more acronyms you add, the harder it is to scale your growth rate. So as we continue to invest in pods, I think, for us, probably the number one learning is like, how can we make this ecosystem feel like something that an agency or a, top 100 buyer wants to buy and can truly understand the performance of? As right now, it's very complex to do that in pods.
And you guys have done such a good job on the music side of introducing indie artists within the context of, maybe more well-known artists, and you guys have playlists and people are discovering new artists constantly on your platform. As podcasts become a larger share of time spent, or just as you said, have become a larger priority, how do you help with the discovery there of indie podcasts or people like us, right? We're kind of a niche podcast, obviously broadening that out. We've got people like you joining, but, we're not broad based. And so how do you help users find new podcasts that they might be interested in, try new podcasts, and then pair advertisers that may be a really good fit for someone like taking inventory? We're constantly looking for great advertisers to fit with us, but yeah, how do you help with that discovery process?
Well, Daniel, if you want to scale your audience, I think I just talked about a great ad product that you should be buying.
We're ready for it.
So,
there.
that's one great option. Would love to have you guys talk about it. But yeah, to your point, I think, looking out at last year, 2023, I think we paid out just about a little bit over 9 billion to the music industry as a whole, with roughly 50% of that to indie labels. And so, you're looking at 4.5 billion paid out by Spotify to indies. And that's an incredible number, right? It's record setting for any part of the industry. We need to make sure that we're doing the same thing in podcasts so we can get exposure in those areas. And so I think I don't want to speak to the amazing teams that have been doing all of that work in that area, but, it kind of breaks down relatively simply to, if you trust Spotify to recommend you new music, which it seems you both do, and, our users and that growing, monthly user number we have says that we have some trust in that area. We need to make sure that our algorithms, personalization, and machine learning are really representing the same way about that. And, this is a pretty exciting area for us across the whole company. And if you think about the expansion that we've seen kind of, from LLMs and, AI, we can actually start to understand every second of a podcast and what features and what data and what potential ranking vectors you can pull out of that. And so, today we've talked a lot about music. We've talked a lot about pods. We've talked a lot about advertising. And so we can pull basically those features and those keys out of that information to then roll those back in to the machine learning and ranking model that we present to the users about the content that they get and the content that they see when they open up Spotify for that day. So if you're always listening to podcasts about golf and then a podcast that you haven't heard a lot about starts to talk about golf, maybe that's something that we should recommend, because we've now been able to do text to speech models or speech to text models that allow us to grab onto that key to understand that this is a topic in that piece of information, and we should service it to users that are interested in that. And so, I think a lot of the major platforms now come down to how well your personalization and your machine learning algorithms are to surface the best content for you as an end user. And so for us, we obviously now have, 3 different discrete types of content on the platform. We've got music, we've got podcasts, and we've got audiobooks. And so, we have to make sure that we're weighting those correctly. We're ranking the right one for you based off the time and how much session time you have remaining. Like, if you're on a run, I don't think I'd recommend you like a book by Homer that's going to be 24 hours long because it's, you need something that's 24 minutes long. And so I think there's a lot that we can do about understanding the content of a pod, as well as understanding the context that a user is in. And, the algorithms that you use for content ranking are really not that different than the ones that you might use for ad ranking. And we're trying to use a very similar data set in both buckets here at Spotify.
And is it unified to the level it was, or we aspired it to be, like at Snap?
I think with any large digital business, the expansion of data probably grows faster than the ability that you can clean up that data to make it like a clean feature that you'd want to rank on. But in some ways, like that model of like, oh, I want to attach this data to like this descriptor or something, or this categorical bucket is sort of going away with the advancements that you're seeing in AI. And so like, in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no, because technology has just been advancing so fast when it comes to AI that you don't really need to think about labeling as you used to, because so much of the training data already has been, labeled and trained by things like OpenAI or some of these other great AI companies that are out there.
And then, as you're building products, like in particular, I guess on the like that, the streams one, there's like these objective based models that you're going to roll out. How different is it, like shipping those today now that you have access to these LMs than like what they were even like 3 years ago? Like, has it like totally changed, or is it just like the behind the scenes logic on it? Any insight on it?
I think both could be true. It's definitely totally changed, but like everything's totally changed every couple of years in tech, and particularly in ad tech. I feel like we're changing at the fastest rate ever. And if we looked at some of these models many years ago, we might be using a lot of data that now we can't because of regulation or Apple or some of the others that are in place. So you're always trying to evolve and use more of your first party signals and your first party data about those outcomes. But at the same note, like just the ability to process data with some of the chips that we're seeing now is just so much faster. Like we can push way more data into a model today than you were even able to do 2 or 3 years ago, just because of how much faster you can do it, and how much cheaper it is. And if we're looking at something now, it could be an order of magnitude cheaper than it was a year ago, and that really provides probably the best consumer outcome. Is like you want a product, particularly a product that is about your taste and your personalization and what you consume, like in your ears. It's very intimate if you think about an audio-based product. And you want that to be as relevant as possible. And so I think for us, when it comes to like something like a streams objective, I think that actually the pressure on an ads business is higher now than it ever was before, because some of the best platforms have made their ads so relevant that they feel just like they're part of the content. And so if you have an ad that is not feeling as relevant as it was before, you're actually creating, even though it may be an improvement on where your user experience was prior, it needs to be a step change better. Otherwise, it feels way worse because you're all being compared to the time spent that a user spends during the day. And so I think like the pressure is actually higher now, making it a harder problem. But the ease and the ability to do that is significantly cheaper than it was a long time ago.
On the ad relevancy side, I think historically, we can all agree radio was great for kind of local advertising and for getting foot traffic and driving you places within your 5, 10, 20-mile radius. I imagine it's very similar for you guys because you know where I am, as you said. You know a lot of contextual things about me, where I live, where I go, when I run, places that I travel. And so how are you guys getting more of the SMB or mid-market advertisers onto the platform to engage in a way that you guys have done such a great job with the big brands?
Yeah, I think we're definitely still in a ramping period for that as an ads business. But it's one that, I think if you look at the evolution of where we've taken kind of Ad Studio, our self-service product, you've seen the usability really step up a lot on that in the last year. If we look a year ago, we were basically just selling everything in there by tonnage, right? This many impressions or, this much reach. And now we're starting to offer metrics that are moving down funnel. or ones that are allowed to be more correlated to what your business objectives are. So we really launched this initiative over the last year to build objectives that will service the small businesses that are within our environment. And I think like there's like the term SMB is like it's got a lot of bloat to it because it can mean a lot of different things. Like, does this mean like the Shopify retailer who's doing 20 million in net sales a year, or does this mean like the coffee shop that's on my corner? Both of those can be in kind of that SMB bucket. And, I think for us, particularly with the type of user that we have on the platform, a lot of our small businesses are definitely tied to the music industry. Maybe they're promoting concerts or they're promoting new albums. And so, I think that's a service that we really can offer a great value prop to a lot of the clients. And, I think, we scroll through Instagram or Twitter or Facebook today, we might see like an ad like, oh, buy concert tickets. And like, might make a lot more sense for those dollars to be on our platform since we know a lot about the listening behavior and our targeting and our optimization is going to be much more relevant. And so, I think when we think about kind of that consumption or what is similar to the consumption that's on platform, that's really where I think the best S&P opportunity for us exists in the short term, as we expand and kind of build out more of these machine learning models and get more scale in purchases. But, if you think about what our products offer, the audio ad that's on, it's sound on, a user hears it, and, it's a really high impact ad product. And, I think for us, using something like brand lift, is one of the most powerful, I think, probably measurement products that exists for audio. Cause it's like, it's very much a very present ad. And I think as we see more and more ads throughout the day, we become very ad blind visually to a lot of the ads that we see across the internet or social services. But when you hear the sound on because it's embedded in that experience, or even an ad that's, host read within a podcast, it's hard to really have a better ad than that today because it feels so much more native to the content and much less likely for a user to skip. And so, I think that from an ad product perspective, we're much more present. And I think that's something that is maybe being overlooked by a lot of small businesses that have really bought into kind of like, the Apple search ad story or something like the Facebook story, and may not be thinking about audio as a key part of their mix and the need to expand. And, I think that's an area where we're really trying to make a difference this year of education, building products for these businesses and making sure that they have ease of access.
And then, before we wrap, one question that we just always ask that was kind of great to get your point of view on is like, so given that we've always kind of worked in more of these like more stringent walled gardens and you're in what do you call it, a fenced in village. How should we think about the trade desk and like that relationship within this context? Like, and yeah, like what does the future look like for like DSPs and like someone like you who, like, to your point, commands a ton of screen time, but maybe today has like less direct exposure to the demand side?
Yeah. So, I think there's a few things that I talk a little bit about in this space. And the first one, and this seems kind of like counter to the direct question you asked me, but I think if you look at a few of these businesses that are like more of the hybrid model, you've also got Disney kind of in that hybrid bucket as well. And I think a number of pieces of information have come out recently about kind of like their ad tech stack. And I think they've got like this central brain that they're called Yoda or something along those lines, like good Disney IP, within there to tie up to it. But, in general, I think that there are a few principles that you should think about in this area that like maybe for me change the way I would think about like open internet versus closed walled garden. And what is around like giving the user the ability to provide response and feedback on an ad. So if you have a platform where a user can say like, I like this ad or I don't like this ad, and that's owned by the platform, I think that's a really important key to like ranking and relevance and, there. And then two, I think it's also like from an ad tech perspective, it's important to understand how many ad servers are in play within one of these environments. If there's a business and it's got, like 5 or 6 different ad servers and some sort of like mediation layer or waterfall, that is actually like probably not great for the consumer because it does create latency between the different layers of the waterfall and the response time for the creative to be sent back and forth. And so like, I think if you're thinking about the differences between like a fully open platform and a fully closed platform, thinking about what a consumer can do and what the impact of that consumer experience is pretty important. And if like you're putting a lot of latency, you load a web page or you load a mobile app and there's like a gray box and then like, a second later the ad loads, like that's a bad experience. And that's not one that I think ad tech should be pushing forward. But I do think that there's a lot of potential that exists to being much more yield maximizing by having many types of demand compete with owned and operating demand, compete with third party demand to make sure that the platform can monetize in the best way. And, it's probably something that, some people are working on building out there in the ecosystem. It's like finding ways to take this third party demand that is something like the Trade Desk or something like DV360 and having that compete with native and sold demand for the most maximum yield. I think if you look at too much of the inventory being like fenced off or pre-priced for some of those areas, that probably puts a disservice to the publisher that's in place about not being as, top line friendly as it could be and ignoring a lot of the user feedback.
So like, will you guys always let Trade Desk in there? Is that the way of saying?
There's a lot of great partners that are out there. And, for the RTB ecosystem, there's a lot of movement in terms of like the different identifiers, right? You've got like UID2, you've got ID5, you've got things like Amazon Ad ID. And that probably the biggest problem right now is that like none of these are exactly the same and they're all sort of based off like a hashed email, but they're all a little bit different. And so, if you're in our shoes, I think we have to look at all of these integrations in terms of like how much investment is it to keep this on and generating revenue for us versus how much work does it really cost to stay up to date with legislation, ID spaces in those areas. And so, I think companies like the Trade Desk, they've done an absolutely phenomenal job at building a DSP. And definitely one of the best in the business, and they're worth what they are for a reason. They're good. But if you're on the other side of it, you really need to think about how much does it cost to stay in business with them. And while that answer for Spotify is a little bit easier to calculate, if you're a smaller, more singular player, or you've got something like very unique supply, it does become interesting about like how much of my information might be pooled on a certain key, or how much of my information am I still controlling, processor versus controller in those areas. And so I think there will always be a space within the ecosystem for like really strong DSPs. But if I had to bet on it, we probably see some compression in the number of independent DSPs that are out there.
We've talked a lot about ads today, and rightfully so. I mean, you're an expert in the space. But outside of ads, like, what are you most excited about, tech, non-tech?
Oh, great question. I'm obviously excited about our future roadmap that we've been building here. So that's been big for us. In general, I think my interests right now have been pretty dominated by the advancements that we're seeing in some of the hardware that's coming from things like NVIDIA, particularly on the GPU side. And so I think I'm definitely most excited about like the expansion and the ease of access to more robust GPUs. And I think that's something that, we're underpinning in the current ecosystem. I think this came out last week, but if you look back at that quarter where Facebook kind of got beaten up for spending too much on OpEx, it turned out like that was all being spent to get more GPUs. And so, really when we're coming down to it, how strategic you are with your hardware allocation for the AI wave is probably the thing that I think most of us should be incredibly excited about. And cost management plus hardware is probably the most exciting intersection right now that we have in tech.
James, we need to get some experts on here to break down GPUs for us. So if anyone from NVIDIA is listening.
Do you know a good GPU guy? Yeah.
No, I mean, I could probably introduce you to a few of them, but if you're interested in listening to like 5 hours of pretty awesome podcasts, the guys who do Acquire, they've got a 3-part special on NVIDIA and also like an hour and a half with Jensen. And if folks are thinking about like AI and ML, those are some pretty awesome podcasts. I think there's probably like 15 hours of total listening right there. just on hardware and NVIDIA. Learned a lot.
Okay.
Definitely think it was pretty fun.
Okay. Only if there's good contextual ads in there will I listen and click. But anyway, Per, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people learn more about what you're working on at Spotify? I don't know if you guys are hiring or if people want to follow you somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working pretty hard on getting our ads.spotify.com page up, which should be a pretty good overview of our holistic ads business. Also, a quick button there to click and create an ad in Ad Studio. So we definitely recommend folks checking that out. And then, we've also got a series of internal podcasts, or I guess external podcasts that are coming out. And I think a couple by Gustav, one of our co-presidents, talk a little bit about some of the ranking and PC ad work we've done, particularly around AI DJ. And I think those are some pretty exciting areas to dive into about like some of the magic that Spotify is trying to create, and just how much work goes into that. And you guys know this from, previous lives, but it takes a lot to build something that seems like magic to a user. And we often ignore how complicated that is up front. And some of Gustav's pods about the AI DJ really dive into what we were trying to do there. And definitely worth the listen if people are curious about how Spotify's thinking about software development.
All right.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, and those products are awesome. I actually think I texted you about it the other day. Like,
Yeah.
it's like the best use case of consumer AI I feel like I've seen in a long time. And so I can only imagine what we're going to do in the ad side. And yeah, thanks, man, for doing this.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. And we will listen to the 15 hours of Acquired ASAP.
Great. Cool.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And, if folks have feedback, always feel free to reach out about our ad products. We're excited to learn more and see how they're being used in market.
Awesome. Thanks, Per.